Welcome to Miniature Media. This is a colony ship from the newest expansion of Ark Survival Evolved Genesis Part 2. And I'm going to show you how I built this today. So the first thing that I'm going to need to determine is the relationship between all of the different sections and the ring that the colony will inhabit. For the ring portion, I'm using the cardboard interior from a masking tape roll, and I'm just going to be using 2/3 of that, and I'm going to cut it into 2 pieces. This will work out just fine, and will actually be the reference point for all of the future relationships that I build from here on. With the ring figured out now, I know that the forward section is not as bulky as it should be in order to fit that particular relationship. I've got some cardboard tube here that I'm going to use. It's the same kind that you would find inside of aluminum or tinfoil, but this was like 4 feet long. I have no idea what this came from. What I'm going to end up doing with this bits of cardboard here is I'm going to be bulking up portions of the forward section to make it line up a little more rather size-wise, and then I'll work out the shapes by separate pieces of cardboard. Now I'll be turning my attention to the rear section next. There appears to be some kind of cone shape or similar like funnel shape, and it goes from the beginning of the rear section into the main body, and then eventually what I'm imagining is the engine compartment. For the funnel here, I've got a bit of recycled plastic that I'm using. I'm not quite sure where it came from, but I believe it's part of a drink dispenser. I also have some beads here that I'm going to use to represent the fuel tanks that are along the sides of the ship. I don't foresee super glue being strong enough to bond these beads to this cone shape. So what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to sand both surfaces down. And then I'll be moving on to using E6000 instead of super glue, because it's a thicker, more viscous adhesive, and I think it'll actually hold up a lot better. So the reference image that I'm looking at, it does not reflect there being actually 2 separate rings, but I do know from in-game that it is actually 2 separate rings with a gap in the middle. So to kind of break up this ring, I'm going to just take some bits of paper and wrap that around the ring, and then I'm going to leave a gap of a few millimeters, so that way I can just paint that area black, just to kind of give a little bit of visual separation between the 2 distinct parts of the ring. One of the best ways that I find to make sure that I'm making repeatable shapes, especially in something like this where it's futuristic, is to make a template and then use that to recreate your shapes. So what I'm doing here is exactly that. I'm making a paper template that I can then put onto chipboard and know where I need to cut and where I need to mark the chipboard out later on. One other thing as well is to reuse the shapes that you're using in other places in the build to kind of bring it together. So I'm not going to destroy this paper template after I'm done with it. I'm going to keep it. I might modify it a little bit later on, but I'm going to keep the general shape of it together so that way I can keep using it. So working with the chipboard in this fashion, I like to call it score and fold. I don't know if there's actually a proper term for it, but effectively what you're going to do is you're going to figure out where your lines are going to be at. You're going to score into the chipboard at least halfway through. Any more than halfway through and you might actually run into problems. The whole point of this method is that you gradually break into the surface enough so that way you allow the material to bend instead of it snapping or tearing. You can then bend or fold this into the shape that you need. And in this case, I'm making a couple of different cuts here on tapers, and then I'm going to do some other cuts along the ends so I can fold those out. It'll make more sense if you actually just watch what I'm doing. If you enjoy the content here, please make sure to hit the like button. That really does let YouTube know that this is good content to share with others. So looking at my reference image here again, I do see that there are some arrow-like shapes that are on the cone of the rear section. And so I'm just going to cut those out of chipboard. I'm going to use a very thin chipboard that's kind of like what you would get in a cereal box. And I'm going to use that to create the shape and then super glue it down. I've already sanded this cone, so it should stick fairly well. While I'm here working on the rear section, this is actually a good time for me to work out the relationship between the two different diameters of cylinder shapes here in the rear section. There's a smaller one that comes out of this cone shape, and then it gets thicker back where the solar sails come out, as well as where I presume the engine is at. Now, this is actually a perfect example of you're not stuck with what you were doing. You can always adjust things later on. This little bit of cone here that I'm getting from this water pistol was my initial thought for the end of the forward front section. I later on decided that it was too small and I didn't really like it, and I found another piece that had good texture on it already and was a better fit for the size of this. If I was making the whole ship a little bit smaller, then that cone might be proportioned right, but it wasn't. I've gotten a lot of the little components done for this build, and I think it's about time that I start putting them together. It would actually help out really well if I could just see this as more than just a bunch of separate pieces and more like a few separate pieces. I did find this little bottle cap in our recycling that actually seems to be the right scale for what I'm trying to build. In the reference image, there's a ridge pattern that's kind of like this, so I just went ahead and used the bottle cap in this instance. I wasn't thinking about it though, and I cut the top of it off. Granted, that probably made it easier for me to attach the cone to the cardboard and then attach the cap to the cone. But I could have saved myself a step if I just left it alone. While I'm working on that, I wanted to let you guys know that we now have a Patreon campaign. So if you wanted to support the channel, head on over to patreon.com/miniaturemedium. To make the form that goes on the front, I'm using the template that I had just made to create both of the middle and the forward section of that area. I'm going to be taking this one piece instead of two distinct shapes, so that way I can better control the taper from end to end. Whereas if I had broken it into two separate pieces, I would had to have decided how they would come together. Whereas if in one piece, it's just easier. It is one piece, and I just slice it where I need to. Now to the very, very forward part of this, the little pointy area here that I'm working on, I wanted to add a little bit more bulk to the end because it just looked like a layer of chipboard there currently. In this instance though, I will actually be destroying the initial template to make this one, and I'm just doing so by cutting down a few millimeters from each side. I didn't want to have it just being two layers thick, so my approach here is to put a small piece on to elevate the next one, and then that would be the exact same as the one below it, albeit a little shorter and more recessed, but it would give me a little separation instead of it just being a flat detail. The forward section is almost done. I just need to deal with the top of it now. I am reusing previous templates to make this inside section for the very front that will go in and encapsulate the opening of the PVC pipe, and then this top piece that will go above that, as well as a couple of other pieces that will go on top of and below this piece, just to change the silhouette. I'm going to need to create a recess between the bottom bits and the top bits, so it'll look kind of like the window area here. I'm going to pull up the reference image, and you can see these little dotted lights. I'm assuming those are windows. So I need to have a recess for that area. To help with that separation there, I am going to be putting on another bit of cardboard tube here, just to elevate the next section that I'll be putting on. This way, the high point of the tube will hold that a little bit higher. For that top layer that I just mentioned, what I am using is a similar template to what I did for the bottom, but smaller, and the scores are closer together, so it makes it a little bit more rounded, but it does also taper from one end to the other. The only thing that the ring needs now is just for the 2 initial shapes that I made to be hot glued to it, and then that part can be set aside. The build did not go quite as I was expecting, but that's because I am comparing it to my reference material, where I didn't set out to make a replica. I wanted to make something similar to it. That doesn't mean I'm unhappy with it at all. I mean, quite the opposite. I am thrilled with this. I am actually looking at it right now hanging above my window, and I can see small details in there that I put in that I didn't think I would actually be able to see at like 6 feet distance. That would be it for the build portion of this project. Next time I will fully assemble the 3 different sections and begin painting. I decided to split this up because I wanted to show you as much of this process as I could, and I didn't want the video to go on way too long.